A scary number of bodies had been found in a river in Novosibirsk, western Siberia in Russia in October 1996. An older woman named Ludmila was thought to be involved because she was seen acting strangely with some of the victims. People looked for Ludmila in her apartment, but they couldn't find her. Later, it came out that she had a son named Alexander Spesivtsev. He was thought to be in a mental hospital for criminally insane people. A day later, plumbers at the apartment building were prevented from accessing the heating system, which was located in Ludmila's apartment. The plumber said that someone was yelling from behind the door and saying that he was crazy and his mother had locked him in the apartment. Soon, a police officer and a locksmith were called to help the plumber to get into the apartment. When the cop told his co-workers what was going on, the investigation team called the mental health facility to make sure Alexander was still there. There had been a mistake on the part of the clerk, and Alexander had actually been freed 2 years before and was living with his mother. No one knew it, but the investigation team tried to quickly call the police officer at the apartment's front door to tell him to leave right away because Alexander was very dangerous. But it was too late. The locksmith had already unlocked the door and the man went into the flat, even though the man inside was making threats. When they walked in, the smell of death hit them right away. Alexander had fled to the roof and had escaped, but the man had just walked into a death chamber. They found a young woman who was naked and bleeding on the couch and wasn't moving. There was blood all over the walls and there were bowls of human meat in the kitchen. When the police officer went into the bathroom, he discovered another horrific scene. A young woman's body was found in the bathtub. Her head was later found in the apartment's water tank. These findings were just the start of terrible things that were about to come out. Oh, and welcome back to the ASMR True Crime channel. Today I will tell you a story of a mother and a son who killed several people. Please be warned that some details might scare you. Alexander Spesivtsev was born on March 1st in 1970. He was underweight and nearly died, but ultimately survived. Although he was frequently ill, given the nickname Sasha, he was the youngest of 2 children, having an older sister named Nadezhda. They grew up in an apartment building in central Novosibirsk, where their father was abusive and violent, frequently subjecting the entire family to abuse. After suffering abuse for about 15 years, Ludmila, the mother of Alexander, divorced her husband, who left the family and never contacted them again. This impacted Alexander's upbringing. In normal families of the time, parents would sleep in the bedroom and the kids would sleep in the living room, but with the empty space in the bed, Ludmila allowed her son to sleep in her bed until he was 12 years old. Alexander was the shining light in Ludmila's life. She was very protective of her son. Alexander had trouble in school, even though she tried to love and help him. He wasn't friendly, didn't have any friends, and was always picked on by his classmates. He dreamed of taking revenge on everyone who did him wrong. His mother shared his anger toward the mean kids who picked on her sick son. Alexander's sister believed the entire family was antisocial, and both her mother and brother were known to be isolated and did not socialize with co-workers. The abuse and trauma they went through from their father probably made it harder for them to make friends and form bonds. Ludmila once worked as a caretaker at a school, but was dismissed for theft of sanitary equipment. She quickly got a job as an assistant lawyer in a court. Ludmila liked to bring home case files, crime records, and pictures of victims, which exposed Alexander to horrible things when he was young. In the end, this obsession brought them both down. Alexander liked hurting people by setting off firecrackers in elevators, messing with people's door locks, and writing frightening things on the walls of buildings. Despite outrage from those around him, his mother fiercely defended him, dismissing complaints as others being too harsh on her beloved son. Around 1988, Alexander was obsessed with murders. Dinner conversations frequently turned to discussions of gruesome killings and the various methods and circumstances of brutality. Alexander's idea about what was right and wrong became less clear, which eventually led to a mental breakdown and him being sent to a psychiatric hospital. He went back to live with his mother and sister upon his release, but his mother knew he would never really be free. His confused mind and hurt body would always be tied to the terrible things that happened to him in the past. His mother and sister moved out of the apartment to live closer to work, but Ludmila, his mother, made sure to visit him often, bringing him food and money while trying to ignore the haunted look in his eyes. Because he was stuck in his own home, she knew he would always need her. Things took a brief turn for the better when Alexander found himself a girlfriend of 17 years old named Eugenie. At first, they seemed like the perfect match. They read poems, went for long walks, and spent most of their time together in Alexander's apartment. But as the friendship went on, Alexander's romantic side changed into a much darker one. He started to act mean and hurtful towards Eugenie. She had also been abused as a child and wasn't going to let somebody else hurt her. Eugenie tried to leave, but she was trapped in his apartment. Alexander had her locked inside and has hit her over and over again. She couldn't get out of the cycle of rage that had consumed them both. Alexander's mother had been going to the apartment less often to give the couple some space because she hoped that her son had finally found true love. Heavy metal music would play in the background while Alexander beat Eugenie every day for a month. People who lived nearby heard the yelling and the music, but they thought Alexander was just mentally ill. They didn't know Eugenie was in the room in the apartment. The parents of Eugenie started to worry about where she was and eventually called the cops. The cops found her at Alexander's apartment. The police knocked on the door but wouldn't open. They forced their way in and found Eugenie barely alive. She was taken to the hospital but later died from her injuries. Official reports said that she died of being exhausted and having sepsis. There were so many purulent boils on her body that doctors might not have been able to figure out the real cause of her death. Officers quickly found out that Alexander needed help from a psychiatrist. He was later told that he had schizophrenia and was taken to a mental hospital to get help. He did dangerous things while he was there, like getting another prisoner to sew a metal ball into his scrotum. Unfortunately, this caused major and painful problems, like not being able to get an erection and having a lot of inflammations in his genital area. 3 years later, a clerical error at the hospital resulted in law enforcement never being informed of Alexander being discharged, leaving him unsupervised and free to return to his apartment. As he played his music loudly, his mind became consumed by hate and desire for revenge against those who had wronged him in the past. Without the support and supervision he needed, Alexander spiraled further into darkness, with his mental illness dictating his mind every day. At some point during this stage, he got the letter E tattooed on his finger, saying it was in memory of his wife. Despite his feelings of hate and desire for revenge, Alexander didn't see everyone as an enemy. He often visited the train station, where he offered cheap wine and listening ear to the homeless and drunk. However, as he showed kindness to some, the darkness within him continued to grow, fueled by his mental illness and the grudges he held against those who had wronged him. He became unpredictable and dangerous, leaving those around him constantly on edge. It was at this train station that Alexander met Elena Chernova. He invited her back to his apartment with the promise of a nice meal and warmth, but she was never seen alive again. Once they were back at his apartment, they had physical relations, but Alexander was struggling with impotency and could not finish. Eleanor made the fatal mistake of mocking him, and he flew into a rage. Alexander said, "In the end, in the conversation, there was something sharp in her words, and she insulted me. I couldn't stand it, so I took a knife and stabbed her in the chest area." Alexander killed Eleanor. Fate had a twisted sense of humor, and he would not cross paths with another Eleanor. As he brought her back to his apartment, the walls seemed to close around him. The screaming that echoed through the walls was enough to strike fear into all the neighbors, but they shrugged it off as just another one of Alexander's episodes. Little did they know that the music that bled from his apartment was the soundtrack to a deadly game of manipulation and deceit. Alexander's struggles with employment and poverty led him to death. As he roamed the streets, he became filled with hatred towards the children he encountered, whether they were living on the streets or simply unsupervised due to their parents' work. To him, they represented everything he hated about capitalism and the social structures that had failed him. His resentment festered and grew until it consumed him, driving him to do things that he knew were wrong. But he couldn't control the darkness within him, and he began to hunt the innocent children around him. Alexander prowled at a construction site, his beady eyes scanning the area for the next victim, and then he saw them, 6 innocent boys, barely entering their teenage years, completely unaware of the danger that lurked just a few feet away. With a sly grin, he approached them, offering them a pack of cigarettes as bait. They eagerly accepted, their naivety blinding them to the evil that lurked within Alexander's heart. And before they knew it, they were following him back to his apartment, completely unaware of the dark fate that awaited them. Alexander promised to pay them for their services. He asked them to rob an apartment for him, which was actually his apartment, not realizing that the true cost would be their lives. Alexander later said, We went all the way into the apartment, and the last kid closed the door behind him. I suggested they go into my bedroom. They became agitated, suspected something was wrong, and one of them screamed. So I took a knife that was lying on the table in the bedroom and I hit him in the chest. The others began to scream, and then I hit them, once in the chest each of them. I realized that they all died immediately. Then I moved them all to one side in the bedroom. I used a rag I found near the wardrobe to cover them. They lay like this for 4 days. Then I carried them into the hallway, and about a week later, my mother, Ludmila, dropped by. I made her carry the bodies, and I went to sleep in the bedroom. In the morning, when I woke up, there was nothing in the corridor. When my mother did to them, I don't know. I don't touch on the subject. His mother didn't even ask him for an explanation as to why. She just cleaned up the bodies, helping him to first dismember their bodies and then loaded them into buckets. Ludmila carried their bodies away down 9 flights of stairs and dumped them into the river. This is truly horrendous, and now his mother had started to dispose the bodies. The killing spree rarely began. He started to prey on vulnerable people of all ages and gender. They became a murderous duo, disposing of the bodies together in the dead of the night into the river. Alexander's sister did visit the house, but she never took part in anything. But she did witness what happened. As the time went by, the murders built up for both Alexander and Ludmila. They had found a new way to dispose the bodies. They started cooking them and eating them. They would make soups, stews, and various meals. Alexander's dog was also never without a meal or bone to chew on. But the bodies in the river had now been linked to various missing persons, and the authorities knew that they had something serious to deal with. Some report suggested that they could be the victims of human organ trafficking, but most believed that there was a serial killer in the community. Police did a background check on people in the area who may be of interest, but unfortunately, due to a clerical error at the mental institution upon Alexander's release, he did not come up as a living in the area. Ludmila, though, had progressed from just disposing of the bodies to convincing people to go to the apartment. She had been seen by people in the area. A composite was made and police were now on the hunt for her. She had last been seen in a shop escorting 3 young women to her apartment. These would be the final victims of Alexander and Ludmila. But what happened to them is truly the stuff of nightmares. Ludmila asked 3 teenage girls in a shop to help her carry bags to her apartment. They were called Olga, Xenia, and Nastya. They were on their way to a disco and they were all excited, but they agreed to help Ludmila, who herself had other intentions. As they rode the elevator to the 9th floor, when the door suddenly stopped, they were confronted by Ludmila's frail and weak-willed son, Alexander. Despite sensing danger, the girls ignorantly accepted the invitation to enter, never realizing that this would be their last decision. During interrogations, Ludmila showed no remorse, confessing to the chilling events that transpired that fateful day. Everything that happened from there on was beyond terror, she said. The first of all victims was Nastya, and you may even call her the lucky one because she did not last long in the situation. As soon as they entered the apartment, Alexander attacked them with a knife, but Nastya was brave and she hit him hard in the face. This only made Alexander angrier. He example of her, so I killed her with a knife. Alexander did right in front of the 2 other girls, and this was only the beginning. He then forced the other girls to butcher their friend. The girls refused, so he beat them until they eventually complied. After they had finished, Alexander handcuffed them to the radiator. When it was nighttime, the mother, as always, took out the remains the next day, using a bit of flesh from Nastya. Ludmila made a soup for Olga and Senya. Fortunately, they did not know what they were eating, and things became even worse. For a whole month, the 2 teenage girls were chained to this radiator, where Alexander would beat them, put out cigarettes on them, force himself on them, and photograph them. They had a plan to escape, but this was quickly found out by Alexander, who became enraged. He beat them both. He beat Senya so bad that she succumbed to her injuries. Olga was forced along with Ludmila to dismember the remains of Senya. Just a short time after this, when the plumber needed to access the heating system, and Olga was eventually rescued by the police. She had been stabbed in the chest and had a broken arm. She lived long enough back at the hospital to give a statement of the horrific acts which had taken place, but she died less than 24 hours after being rescued. The police made a gruesome discovery while inspecting the apartment. Blood-staining clothing, totaling of 82 sets, was found scattered throughout the dwelling. Along with the garments, 40 pieces of jewelry belonging to women and children were also discovered. Most chilling evidence, however, were the Polaroid pictures of naked victims handcuffed to a radiator. The thought of the suffering endured by the victims is truly haunting. Alexander and Ludmila were questioned by the police at the same time. They argued over the extent of Ludmila's involvement, with her saying she only cleaned up the crime scene, but Alexander argued that she lured victims to the house. Ludmila said in her defense that she only did this due to fearing for her own life. Alexander's sister was also brought in for questioning. She was evaluated by psychiatrists and found to be competent. However, without any evidence linking her to the murders, she was spared from being charged. Alexander later said in a hearing, "It's fun to have 3 girls at once. I often ran out of ideas not knowing what like. Then the angrier I got, the nicer the girls were to me. The girl with the broken leg turned on me a bit. She cried and did not want to participate in our games anymore. She said, 'Please wait until my leg is healed, then I do it gladly.' But then I got angry. What do you do with such a girl?" From the cupboard I took a big piece of paper and then wrote, "Today, Slaughterfest." At first, the girls didn't understand, but believe me, I explained it to them. Those who don't love me anymore and won't do as I say have to die. They were a little shocked when I do not know, because I told them Nastya will live on in us. But it's not so bad. Then I rested it on my bed until my mother came in. She peeled the meat off and made something to eat. Soup, I think it was. When it was done, I brought the dog and sat down with Olga at the table. Mother brought the food, and the kid did not seem to notice what Mother was serving, so I told her, and she spat it all out over the place. Alexander later confessed to 19 murders, although the evidence could only convict him of 4. Authorities strongly suspect that there are 82 victims and potentially more. Alexander was found to be insane, and he was sent to a high-secure psychiatric facility for the rest of his days. He spends all his time undergoing psychiatric testing and writing poems about the evils and democracy. Asked how he justifies his crimes, he said, How many people has our democracy destroyed? If people thought about that, there wouldn't be any of this filth. But what can you do? Alexander said he wants to sell his head to some institute so they can study his brain and get paid in advance in cigarettes. His mother, on the other hand, has withdrawn into herself, and she has not uttered a word since her arrest. Ludmilla was sentenced to 15 years in prison. She was released in 2008 after only serving 13 years. A group of concerned citizens were formed in 2016 to keep a watchful eye on Ludmilla. The group has a deep-seated fear she may harm others again. They report on her every move on social media, constantly worried that her son may one day be released into her care, and that the two will resume their harmful behavior. The community lives in fear of Ludmilla's next move. That's all we got for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this story, although it's very horrific.